Hello everybody. So, going to be talking about tree nutrition and fertilization this go around. So, let's see what we've got. So, what do plants need to grow? So, how do plants actually grow? Well, we know the basics of it. We've talked about photosynthesis before. The idea of sunlight plus the carbon dioxide in the air plus water. And then those things together are going to combine in the plant. The plant's going to take them in, and then the plant's going to give off oxygen because it's going to keep the carbon of the carbon dioxide, keeps the carbon, gives off the oxygen, and then through the process of photosynthesis, it creates glucose or sugar, creates the energy that then can get used by the plant and transferred out of the plant. And we know that the roots and the soil, which we talked about before, take a really beneficial role here for the plants because that's where the water is going to come from. The water is going to be in the soil and it's going to be brought up through the roots. The other important part of the roots we've talked about also is the idea of anchoring in and the idea of keeping the plant stable. And so all of that comes into play in terms of plants needing to grow. So then what we really then need to focus on is we can say, well, this is what a plant needs to grow, and we're okay with that. But what we're really thinking about now is what does a plant need to grow well? So how does a plant grow, a plant or a tree or any woody thing? How does it actually grow well? And that's where we need to understand that trees have certain essential elements that are important. And so a nutrient, whenever we're talking about the essential elements, we're talking about the nutrients that the plant needs to function well. And so when we're talking about that, we're talking about things like magnesium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, silicon, all these minerals that are going to be available through the soil are going to be extremely important in terms of making sure that the plant is healthy. It's actually the same thing in people. If you're having issues with something, more than likely it's because you're missing one of these essential elements. In this case, trees and plants aren't necessarily, trees, plants, and humans aren't necessarily very different. But there are specific elements that we need, just like the tree needs, to be healthy and happy and grow to our biggest potential. And so the elements that we really want to focus on in terms of plants, the big three are going to be nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But in terms of essential elements that the plant needs, it needs all of these. It needs different doses of all of these, but it needs all of them. So calcium, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, chlorine, iron, boron, manganese, molybdenum, zinc, copper, and nickel. We need all of those for proper plant growth. So if these are the 17 most essential plant elements right here that are needed, if we look at the periodic table of elements, which hopefully we're all comfortable with, and if you say to yourself, "Oh man, chemistry, I'm not really good at that," I don't need you to memorize any of this fancy stuff. I just need you to understand that there is this bit of chemistry involved, and that we are talking about these essential elements. And when we're talking about nutrients and essential elements, we are just back down to the idea of the periodic table. Go. And if we just kind of click along, you see where they came from. Now, in terms of macronutrients, so macronutrients being the chemical elements needed in large amounts for plant growth. So these are the ones that the plant needs the most, has to have these. And in terms of soil nutrients, it's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, but really a bigger emphasis on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. How do we know this? Because when we actually go to the store and we see bags of fertilizer, all we're going to see in those bags of fertilizer: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, because those are more than likely going to be the ones that are limiting, because they're the ones that are most needed. If we take it down to one, well, we need one. What's the one that we need more than the other ones? Nitrogen. No doubt, 100%. How do we know that? Well, one of the easiest ways we know that for sure is because we look at the atmosphere on our planet. What's the biggest element in our atmosphere? It's not oxygen, even though that's the one we need, but there's enough oxygen that we're comfortable. It's nitrogen. The majority of our atmosphere is actually made up of nitrogen. Why? Because that's how we get all the plants to grow, and that's how we can say stuff like there's more trees on this planet than there are stars in the galaxy. How could you possibly have so many trees on this planet than there are stars in the galaxy? Because our atmosphere is full of nitrogen, and if it's full of nitrogen, then we can grow plants, because that's the element that we need the most. Now then, there's this whole nitrogen cycle, which takes it from the unusable form in the atmosphere and gets it into the soil into a usable form that then the plants can take up, because then it's a soil nutrient, and then it's all part of this really amazing process. And so that's it's really important to understand that more than likely the ones that we need in the largest amounts are NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and the one that we need the most is nitrogen. In our atmosphere, we also can get carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from the atmosphere and from water. So that's where those come into play as well. So the idea that we're going to get nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur out of the soil, but just in the atmosphere. So why does the plant grow above ground? Well, because we need that sunlight for photosynthesis, but then we can also get the carbon and the oxygen through carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and then we get the hydrogen from water. So it all ties together, it all works out. It's all a very beautiful dance. In terms of secondary nutrients, so other chemical elements needed in moderate amounts, so not large amounts, but moderate amounts. Our secondary ones for sure are calcium and magnesium. Those are extremely important for plant growth, not as important as our macronutrients, but still very necessary. I mean, I guess we could kind of call these our middle nutrients if we wanted to. But then we go from macronutrients and secondary nutrients to our micronutrients. So in terms of our micronutrients, these are our chemical elements that are needed in small amounts for plant growth. So we need trace levels of chlorine, iron, boron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc, copper, nickel. Now, what's going to be interesting about these is that it's going to really depend on the pH of our soil and whether we have a more acidic soil or a more alkaline soil. And so if we take a look at this simple nutrient availability and pH chart, you can see that at certain parts it widens out here, and then at certain parts it narrows. And so nitrogen is pretty much available anywhere between 5 and 9. So if we have an acidic soil or an alkaline soil, we can get nitrogen. But what we really want is a soil that's like in this 6, 7, 8 range, somewhere in there where we got lots of nitrogen available. But now we start looking at our other ones. Well, what about phosphorus? Well, phosphorus, it's really only like 6.5 to 8 is where it's most available. And then potassium, well, from 6 to 9, potassium's available. So if we think about our 3 big macronutrients, now here's what's interesting is for our forest soils, the majority of them are going to fall more towards this 6, 6.5, maybe even down to 5.5 range. We're going to get, our soils are going to be a little more acidic. So we need to look at how does that affect some of our nutrient intake. Well, we're good on potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in that range. We're good on sulfur, calcium, no big deal. Magnesium, a little bit of a struggle, but we'll be all right if we are more getting towards neutral than we are towards acidic. The more acidic our soil is, the harder it's going to be to get to magnesium. But really good for iron, really good for manganese, really good for boron. If we have more alkaline soils, those sorts of things aren't very readily available. Copper and zinc, excellent. Molybdenum, also good. So when we have our soils kind of hit this little range, it's not too bad. Phosphorus, depending on where our pH actually lands, phosphorus may become limiting. Magnesium may become limiting. Maybe even some struggles with calcium, but sitting probably pretty good with nutrient availability on the other ones. Now, if we have a more alkaline soil, because not all of our soils, just overall most of our soils tend to sit more acidic. If we kind of look over to the more alkaline side, the more basic side, you can see we'd have much more struggles trying to make, especially the micronutrients, trying to make sure that our secondary nutrients and then our micronutrients, that we have enough available or enough readily available to where our plant's not going to struggle, or we're going to need to constantly be checking over and over again and making sure that our trees are getting what they need. Here's another look at that same chart, and we've got this one goes all the way from 4 to 10, as opposed to the last one went from 5 to 9, and you can see that if we talk about that kind of 5.5 to 6.5 range, where the majority of our soils, forest soils, are going to land, we'll be okay with nitrogen. Phosphorus could be an issue. Potassium, we're good. Sulfur, we're good. Calcium, probably good. Magnesium, probably good. And then iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc, we're good. And maybe some issues with molybdenum, but for the most part, we're hitting pretty good on a lot of those nutrients, and so they should be readily available in what we will see for the majority of our soils. If we're talking about ideal tree pH, right? So if we said what would be perfect, well, water is about a 7, and so if we really were hoping for ideal, we'd want this 6.5 to almost 7.5 range. That would be ideal. However, we know that the majority of stuff actually falls more towards this acidic side. And if we get over here into this really more basic range, you can see this happening sometimes in a lot more urban soils, and instead of being over here like we would see in the forest, or in this really ideal range where everything would be kind of easy in terms of these micronutrients, because you can look and see, well, there's not really anything that would be much of a struggle if we were in this ideal range. When we get over here, there's a good chance that there could be some struggles, but you know, you'd be all right too. But when you get really towards the ends of the pH spectrum, that's where you start possibly having some issues. So what's kind of interesting to note, especially with this idea of urban soils, is that a tree may be growing in a modified soil or an environment that does not get what it needs in terms of the essential elements. And so what do we mean by that? Well, if we take this look at this picture right here, and we really think about it, in a forest, you've got you've got soil next to other soil, and sometimes our tree roots can grow together, and then maybe we get mycorrhizae connections where our fungi create, you know, a big, huge underground food web, and everybody's happy and all this. But now, if this tree's kind of by itself, like, its roots are going to spread out, but its roots have to kind of spread out in different ways, and then also we're not getting that water intake that we might be getting, and we might not, because of this building blocking, we might not be getting all the sun that we need, and so we're only getting parts of what we require, and because of that, you might not get satisfactory growth or development because of you're lacking in some of these elements. Now, depending on what you're trying to accomplish with your tree, maybe that's actually a good thing, because maybe you're planting a 40-foot or 50-foot tall tree that you only want to be 20 or 30 feet tall. But then you start running into the problems. Well, what if we get like a bunch of good rains, or what if it floods and then the tree dies? And then you start having to kind of think about these things that might make it more difficult, as opposed to if we just really thought about what would be the perfect tree for this place. Oh, I'd want a tree that doesn't grow to more than 30 feet high, and then I'm also going to be limited in terms of the amount of soil and water that I get, so I need something that's a little more drought tolerant. And then we put the right tree in the right spot, less thinking, less maintenance, less effort on the backside, more effort in our planning stage. That's kind of the way I like to look at things. But if you take over an area, or you come into work in an area and you got a bunch of trees already planted, and you're just whatever, you're now an arborist for the city of Santa Barbara, you're just gonna have to figure it out. The trees are already there. Now you've got to do your best to keep them alive and keep them happy and keep them healthy. And so what else could really cause you issues with plant nutrition? If you start getting soil deterioration or construction development, because, say if we take our example of you being the arborist from the city of Santa Barbara, and now all of a sudden you're doing some new construction downtown, and then all of a sudden now you start having problems on neighboring streets with the trees, and you start getting some foliage dying or some chlorosis or anything like that. You got to start figuring out like you got to play tree doctor. What's happened? How has this changed? What changed from before? What's going on? Where could I see something different? And you might kind of figure it out. Soil deterioration, what does that mean? The idea of, let's say if you have a hillside that you're in charge of, or is just part of the area that you occupy, and you've been getting a lot of rains lately, to where you start seeing a lot of rills and channels, or micro channels forming because of the rain, and then you start seeing that the soil wears away over time. Or say you manage a park, and your park has paths that people walk on, but then people now aren't quite into walking on the paths, or it becomes really popular with, say, dogs, to where a dog doesn't really stay on the path all the time, and now you start getting all these other little paths going on. That's going to lead to soil deterioration, maybe leading to some compaction, some loss of that macro pore space, which we know is essential for holding air and water. And then that could then lead to this lack of plant nutrition, because then we don't get what we need in terms of our air coming in and out, our water coming in and out, and our everything being able to move through the soil nice and easily, which we need in terms of this plant nutrition, because that's how we're going to get all these essential elements. Is if they're the soil nutrients, which we really focused on the idea of NPK as those soil nutrients, they're going to need to be brought up in solution, which just means they're going to be carried up in the water into the plant through the roots. So if there's a problem with that, where it gets the water movement gets constricted in any way, then it's going to be harder for the plant to take up those nutrients. Or if we're not getting the water that we need, because we know water is essential in this whole process, that could be extremely problematic. So how do we fix that, or how can we amend that? What we need is, we need to fertilize. And so why would we fertilize? So you see this picture here, we can see this tree's kind of wispy and thin in the middle. We've added some fertilization. If you look and see, you can see this nice bed of organic material down here, a little bit of fertilization, and now we got a nice, much healthier looking tree right there. So why fertilize? And what is fertilization? I mean, we're really talking about the idea of just like, can we help out our trees? We kind of know that there's this basic process of essential elements that are important to the trees. So how are we going to help them out? And why would we help them out? Well, let's talk about the why. Fertilizing can increase growth. It can reduce susceptibility to certain diseases and insect pests, and it can help reverse declining health. And so that's extremely important in terms of if we see declines in health or we see problems, we really want to just help the tree out and see if we can bring it back. We don't want to lose trees to diseases or pests. So if we can do something in terms of fertilization, that's going to keep the tree healthy while we figure out how to get rid of the pest. That would be extremely useful to us. Or we just want to increase growth. We really want to have nice, healthy looking trees. So all of those are advantages of plant nutrition and fertilizing. So what is a fertilizer? By definition, a fertilizer is any material, whether it's organic or inorganic, natural or synthetic, that's going to supply the plant with necessary nutrients for plant growth and optimum yield. Optimum yield just meaning what is the best that this plant can do, especially if we're looking at something like an oak tree and we really want, if we're running a park and we really want our oak trees to produce acorns at a high amount because we really want to have a nice deer population, because we know our local community really loves the idea of seeing the deer out in the morning or seeing elk out in the morning or that sort of a thing. Then we know we need to provide them with a food supply, which means the food supply we know can come from the trees, which means we're going to have to make sure that they're producing a good amount of acorns and constantly producing that good amount of acorns. And all of that can be helped out by us. We don't necessarily need to be in control of it necessarily, but we can make sure that if we see any problems or if we think that we need to help out the environment in any way, we have a way of doing that through fertilization. But the big thing is we really want to do it the proper way. So we're going to do it according to the International Society of Arboriculture, or the ISA best practices for tree and shrub fertilization. So we have a manual that you can look up at any time, and that's going to be your best practices. So if you have those kind of questions like, well, what should I do? What kind of fertilizer? How much fertilizer? That sort of a thing. We have a manual that kind of walks you through the whole thing. So what do you need to know to fertilize? Like, if we're going to do this, how do we do it? So you need to come up with an objective, a reason why you're doing it. You need to figure out what type of fertilizer you're going to use. You need to figure out the application rate. So when you're going to do it, how much are you going to do it, the timing of when you're going to do it, the method of how you're going to do it, and then your location, where exactly, because not all fertilization or not all fertilizers are the same. So let's start with a complete fertilizer. So a complete fertilizer is a fertilizer that contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Like we said, those are our main macronutrients, and so we're really interested in making sure that the plant has those, because we know the plant needs them in large amounts, and so more than likely those are going to be our limiting factors. And when I say limiting factors, meaning once we have a problem, the first place we should look is what you would think the limiting factor would be, the one that's going to limit you from reaching your potential. And more than likely it's going to come down to NPK, or like we talked before with the idea of water management, is just not enough water, because we know that we need water to even get these things into the plant. And so if we take a look at this bag here, I know my picture's in the way, but this first number is going to be nitrogen, your second number is going to be your phosphorus, your third number is going to be your potassium. So your phosphorus is going to be phosphate, and it's usually going to be phosphoric acid, and the potassium is going to be in the form of potash. And so let's take a look at, because we got these three numbers like 10, 5, 5 here, what does that actually mean? So if we take a look here at this complete fertilizer, so we've got it says a 10, 6, 4 on this bag that we're looking at. So what that means is it's going to be 10% nitrogen, 6% potash, and 6% phosphoric acid, and 4% soluble potash. And so when you're looking at these numbers, you're looking at the percentage of each of these things: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, the thing that's going to be interesting to understand is sometimes the bag won't say NPK. It won't say nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. It will just say like 10, 6, 4, and you just need to understand that it's always in this order: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Yep. Okay. So now, how do we actually know what we're getting in a bag of fertilizer, right? Because we said, well, because if you think about it, it's like, well, how do I figure that out? Okay, well, let's take the example, an easy example of like a 100-pound bag. So if we take a 100-pound bag and we've got 10-5-5 as this example, so 10% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, 5% potassium, 5% potassium. Then what we're saying is the idea of 10% times 100 pounds is 10 pounds, 5% times 100 pounds, 5 pounds, and then 5% again is 5 pounds. So within this bag, in this 100-pound bag, there is 10 pounds of nitrogen, 5 pounds of phosphorus, 5 pounds of potassium. And so that's whether you just take that basic math to it, whether it's a 20-pound bag, 30-pound bag, 50-pound bag, whatever it is, it's just there's going to be 10% of it's going to be nitrogen, 5% of it phosphorus, 5% of it potassium in this specific example. So then what I'm hoping is in your head you're like, okay, but what about the rest of the bag? So if we look at this here, so what we're saying is we got, if it's a 50-pound bag, right, we're going to have, in this example, so if we say this is a 50-pound bag with 10, 6, and 4, right, so we're going to have 5 pounds of actual nitrogen in this bag, 3 pounds of phosphorus, and 2 pounds of potassium in this bag. So that's 10 pounds of the nutrients that we need to put in the soil. We're going to also then have 40 pounds of carrier, which is basically going to be or organic matter, topsoil, to then give us our 50 pounds of fertilizer. And so why have this this like organic rich topsoil that this nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is mixed into is because what we want to do is we want to make sure we are adding something to the soil that makes it really easy for these nutrients to transfer from this to the rest of our soil. And we know that that topsoil and organic matter does that really well. So that's what's going to be that the rest of the bag, that carrier, is going to be more of that sort of soil and organic matter, which is really easy to get these nutrients into our soil. So we started off with the idea of complete fertilizer. There's also the idea of a high analysis fertilizer and a low analysis fertilizer. And so if we're looking at a high analysis fertilizer, the complete fertilizer percentage is going to be over 30%. So if I had like a 20-10-10, that would be 40%. So that would be a high analysis fertilizer. A low analysis fertilizer would be like the examples we just saw, like a 10-5-5. That's only 20%. So that would be considered a low analysis fertilizer. At the beginning, we talked about the idea of inorganic versus organic fertilizers. So organic fertilizers are natural materials of either plant or animal origin. So organic fertilizers, things like livestock manure, other green manures, crop residues, household waste, if you compost, woodland litter, all those things are organic fertilizers. Inorganic or mineral fertilizers are going to be your fertilizers that are mined from mineral deposits and hopefully with little processing. So things like lime, potash, phosphate, rock, or industrial manufactured materials through chemical processes like urea would be one good example. And inorganic fertilizers are going to really vary in appearance depending on the amount of manufacturing. Whereas something like organic fertilizers, like, I think we all kind of know what livestock manure looks like, or what compost looks like, or crop residues. Well, what would be like a crop residue? Well, whatever's left over. Think about a corn harvest. Like, what do you do with all the stalks of corn and all of that? So that's what we're talking about in terms of crop residues. Woodland litter, pine needles, leaves, that sort of stuff. So taking a look and just kind of thinking about, like, what does some of this stuff look like, because certainly the fertilizer I use in my backyard looks much more like this than it does like manure or mulch or anything like that. Your particles can be of different sizes and shapes. You can have crystals, pellets, granules, something that looks more like a dust. There are fertilizer grades, so you have straight fertilizers, which contain one nutrient element only. You've got compound fertilizers, that's 2 or more nutrients, usually combined in some sort of a mixture by chemical interaction. And then you can have fertilizer blends, which are formed by physically blending mineral fertilizers to obtain desired nutrient ratios. So with your inorganic fertilizers, why use inorganic fertilizers? Well, inorganic fertilizers are going to release their elements relatively quickly in water, which is a great thing because we want those elements to get into the plant right away. Your inorganic ions are going to be absorbed by oppositely charged sites on the root membrane, which is perfect. They just bind right in, which is exactly what we're looking for. The osmotic potential of the soil draining out of the roots. So when the ions are in excess concentration, so when you get like too much of this, your osmotic potential of the soil draining out is much higher. So there can be a little bit too much of this at some point. So you got to make sure that you get your amounts right, because it really, especially with the idea of fertilization, it goes back to everything else, just like our water or anything else. Too little is you're not going to get what you need. Too much could cause you more problems than you want, and the right amount is exactly what you need. Slow release fertilizers. So slow release fertilizers allow for gradual nutrient dispersal, and it's desired to give the tree a long-term feeding. And so if we look here at this 30, 10, and 7, so that would be that high analysis fertilizer, because that's 47% of this bag is going to be our nutrients. This is designed for a much slower effect, but it's supposed to be over time. You don't have to do this as often, and it's more of a long-term process. So what's going to be really important to understand when talking about the idea of tree nutrition and the idea of fertilization is making sure that we're really fertilizing in the right spots. And so we have to really understand the idea of our feeder roots and where our feeder roots might be. So we've got our critical root zone right here. It extends from the trunk to the drip line, or to a distance of 1 foot per inch of DBH, whichever is greater. Usually most people just kind of go off of the drip line. So when you see fertilization done, you'll definitely see it done basically to the width of the canopy. But we also have to really understand that sometimes our root zone can actually can extend out 2 to 3 times the size of the canopy. So we've got this example up here, how people think tree roots grow, but how tree roots actually really grow. And so it's really important to understand that your roots may grow out farther than you think, and fertilizing in the right area and making sure that spreading out your fertilizer might actually be more beneficial than you think. So then let's talk about plant deficiencies, because I think what's really important is we just covered the idea of, we know that trees need these essential elements. So what are these essential elements? How do we get these essential elements. If we see a problem, what do? We use fertilizer to help us with that problem. But I think the part that we haven't talked about yet is how do we know that we have a problem, and what are signs that we have a problem? And so, if we see something like this on our plants, we might say, well, okay, well, we need to fix this. We need to put some nutrients in our tree. We need to fertilize. But this is actually a insect problem. This is a spider mite problem. So it's really important that we get good at understanding what are the signs of plant deficiency, so that we know, do we need to come up with some sort of a pest treatment? Is it fine? Or do we need to do something? What do we need to do? What is the right course of action? Because that's going to be ultimately really important as an arborist, is for you to figure out how to go about things, doing it the right way, so that you don't have to keep dealing with the same problems over and over again, and you start building a knowledge bank of, okay, in this situation, this is what I did. In this situation, this is what I did. And now you start having a lot of answers and a lot of solutions for people, which is a great place to be. So many symptoms may appear similar, but might have slight differences. So we're looking at this deficiency chart of micronutrients. So we'll kind of break it down and then go one by one through here. So boron up here. So discoloration of the leaf buds, breaking and dropping of the buds. So you can see this really like brown wilted look could be a sign of a boron deficiency. A sulfur deficiency. Leaves are light green, veins are pale green, no spots. So if we get this really light green, yellowish look, and then the veins as well being a pale green, and you have no spotting, this could be a sulfur deficiency. Manganese, leaves are going to be pale in color. The veins and venules are going to be dark green and reticulated. So they're going to kind of stand out a little bit. And so you see how you got that, you get the light color as well, but then you're going to have dark colored veins in there. If we've got a zinc deficiency, so our leaves are going to be pale. We're going to have narrow and short veins being dark green, and dark spots are going to be on the leaves and edges. And you can see right here those dark spots. You can see the narrow and short veins are going to be dark green, and then we get our light spots. So that's a zinc deficiency. Magnesium, paleness from the leaf edges, no spots. Edges have cup-shaped folds. Leaves die and drop in extreme deficiency. So you're going to see the edges are going to have cup-shaped folds, so they're going to round off, and your paleness is going to kind of come from the leaf edges. And so you're really only going to see your green colors towards your midrib and in your veins, and everything else should be that pale color and getting some of that folding happening. With your calcium, the plant is going to be dark green. Your tender leaves or your young leaves or your newer leaves towards the outside are going to be pale. Your drying is going to start from the tips, and eventually the leaf will die. If it's an iron deficiency, you're going to have the leaf be pale, no spots, and your major veins are going to be green. Really like dark green in the veins, but light in the leaf. In terms of a copper deficiency, pale pink between the veins, so it's a pinkish color between the veins here, a much more reddish color to it, and you're going to see wilt and drop. So a lot of these other ones, you don't see this wilt and drop that you'll see in copper. In terms of molybdenum, your leaves are going to be light green, lemon, yellow, or orange. Your spots are going to be on the whole leaf except for the veins, and you're going to also get sticky secretions under the leaf. So that one's going to be a lot obvious because you're going to have all these spots and you're going to get those sticky secretions, and it's much more obvious than some of these where it could be this or it could be that. In terms of potassium, small spots on the leaf tips, edges of the leaf, edges are of the pale leaves as well. So small spots on the tips and the edges of the pale leaves. Your spots are going to turn rusty, and then you're going to get fold at the tip. So you see how you're getting this brown fold at the tip and you had spots, but then the spots are going to turn into that rust that then becomes part of that brown. So we also have phosphorus. So your plant is going to be short and dark green. So notice how this is what the normal leaf should look like, but instead we've got this kind of shorter leaf that's just not not doing as well as the other ones. In extreme deficiencies, it's going to turn brown or black, and you can see that on this side that it's got that kind of black color to it, and it's going to have a bronze color on the underside of a leaf if it's a phosphorus deficiency. And then in terms of a nitrogen deficiency, you're going to see stunted growth. So once again, should be this size of a leaf, but we don't see that at all, and we see almost a different shaped leaf. You're going to get that extremely pale color. The leaves are going to be upright, so they've got this upright look to them where they're actually holding themselves up more with light green and yellowish appearance, and then they're going to have this similar burnt look as potassium in extreme deficiency. Another look at it here, so we got boron up here and calcium up here, that's a sulfur deficiency, our manganese deficiency, zinc deficiency, a magnesium deficiency here, phosphorus deficiency here, nitrogen deficiency here, potassium deficiency, molybdenum, copper. Copper is real easy to see because we get that leaf droop. Our iron deficiency right here, where we get definitely that like really a lighter, different color to it, and calcium back up top. On your terminal buds, you can see calcium and boron. Young leaves, you'd really be looking at like copper, sulfur, iron, manganese. On old leaves, your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, zinc, and molybdenum. Here's just a kind of another look at it in terms of a simple plant deficiency guide. So calcium, your new leaves, so your younger leaves are going to be misshapen or stunted, and your existing leaves could still be remaining green. With iron, your young leaves are going to be yellow and white with green veins. The mature leaves would be normal. If it's older growth, so not the New Year's growth, nitrogen, upper leaves light green, where the lower leaves are yellow. Bottom or older leaves are yellow and shriveled. Potassium, yellowing at the tips and edges. Dead or yellow patches develop on leaves. Manganese, yellow spots or elongated holes between the veins. Carbon dioxide, you're going to get white deposits on leaves, stunted growth, and plant dieback. Phosphate, the leaves are darker than normal, and you get a loss of leaves. And magnesium, you're going to get the yellowish color. It's going to be greener back towards the tip, but yellowish on the outside, and your veins are going to be green. And so if you're saying to yourself, well, the one kind of said one thing and this one said kind of the same but a little bit different, that's part of it. You're going to just have to figure out, because it's not always going to look the same. Every plant's not going to react exactly the same. Just like if you're a doctor for human beings and somebody comes in, not every person reacts to a cold in the same way. Not every person's going to show the exact same symptoms when they're sick, but they might be sick with the exact same thing. And that's what's hard, but that's also what makes it interesting. Here's another look at the different deficiencies. So specifically focusing on our idea of NPK. So here's a healthy leaf shining with a dark, rich color when it's adequately fed and everything's going well and great and it is happy. If we got a phosphate shortage, it's going to be reddish purple, particularly on young plants. If we have a potassium or potash deficiency, it's going to be as a firing or drying along the tips and edges of the lowest leaves. And if it's a nitrogen deficiency, yellowing starting at the tip and then moving along the middle of this leaf. So potash, the outside of the leaf, phosphate or our phosphorus, reddish purple, and nitrogen in this case is that the tip starts at the tip really starts to look bad, and then it's going down the middle of the leaf. Here's some other examples. So the idea of that nitrogen deficiency right here. So we can see we get this yellowing of the leaves, and then our veins also not looking great. Here's that phosphorus deficiency that we talked about with that reddish purple look to the leaves, and then a potash deficiency where we get that yellowing in between the veins, and then working its way, starting from the outsides, and then working its way inside. So how can we apply fertilizers? So there's a couple different ways. The way that I'm most used to, and what I do is surface application, at least in my own yard. I just use a dry spreader and just walk around and kind of let it fall all over the lawn. In terms of subsurface methods, there's a drill hole method, which you can see here, or there's also liquid injections. There's foliar application, so you apply it right to the leaves, which are usually micronutrient sprays. And then you can have implants and injections where you're like directly putting it into the stem or into the plant, which I'm not a huge fan of, because you can cause a problem with injection just as much as you're helping the problem. So here's just in terms of surface application guidelines for irrigation and fertilization. So if we're talking about irrigation, in this case, why are you adding water? Well, we're trying to minimize drought stress. We want, if our natural water source has been altered after root loss due to construction or injury or transplanting, to establish compatible plants, or when using fertilizer, we want to irrigate because that's how the fertilizer works. If we're going to fertilize in this for this oak tree here, we want healthy oaks growing in undisturbed conditions. If we have that, we don't need fertilizer. But if we don't have that, that's when we might be looking for fertilizer. So if it's needed, we're going to use a broadcast fertilizer, specifically in late winter or early spring when the soil is moist and we've got a lot of water, because the whole idea of having water and water available to do this is absolutely crucial. If we don't have the water, we're kind of just wasting our time. Here's another example of the drill hole method. You can see he's got his bag of fertilizer back here. He's got his drill hole, and we're going to fertilize for this tree. Here's just kind of a cartoon example of it, but you drill a hole 2 to 4 inches wide. You want to fill that hole 4 to 8 inches with the fertilizer, but then we also want to leave a couple inches of space for air and water, so that we can so that fills up, and that it will make our elements soluble and really help us get it out to the plant. And if you say to yourself, well, if I'm doing this drill hole method, do I just like drill this one hole and I'm good? No, you'd be drilling multiple holes and trying to spread it out around the tree. Liquid injection, you can see pretty similar process to the drill hole method. Foliar application, like we said, it's usually going to be a spray, and it's going to be a micronutrient spray, and you're just basically spraying the leaves. Big thing that I just always like to mention with something like a foliar application, proper PPE is essential, because this might be healthy for the plant, but even though, yes, we could use micronutrients just like people and trees need the micronutrients, we don't need it in this fashion, and it could really not be great for us, especially for the skin. Injections or applications, and like I said, you can do this, but you could possibly cause just as much problem as you're trying to avoid. So if you're going to do this method, you got to really know what you're doing and do it right. There's also Mycorrhizae fertilizers, because we know the idea of Mycorrhizae is important, especially in our trees and woody plants. So you can see here, you don't see that big amount of Mycorrhizae, and you see here with this tree and shrub Mycorrhizae that you get a lot more of that fungi growing, and that would help our roots be able to absorb more nutrients. So it's kind of another way to do it where instead of just giving the plant the nutrients, you're giving it the means and the method to grab more nutrients out of the soil. So you can do prescription fertilization, and then that's where you basically send in samples and you do laboratory analysis. You do either a foliar analysis or soil analysis, and then that tells you what you need to then add specifically to the soil or to the plant in order to be able to give it what it needs so that you have a healthy, happy tree, hopefully that you don't have to keep managing. But especially when we're thinking about the idea of urban tree care and urban forestry, it might be, depending on how much activity is happening in the area that you manage, and this might be a consistent problem that you have to deal with. But what's important is just to understand that you're going to have to play doctor a little bit. You're going to have to really figure out, what's going on, what's the problem, and, how can I best avoid this? And if you're at the beginning where you get to plant trees and figure out and make sure site and soil match up, that's great. But if you're not, then you really have to just get comfortable with how do I really figure out what's wrong with this tree, and what are the things that I really should start with, right? If I make sure that the water's good and I make sure our NPK is good, then now I know, well, now I'm down to maybe secondary nutrients or a micronutrient deficiency, or maybe I'm looking at this wrong and it's actually some sort of a disease or a pest that I have to deal with. And so you kind of start going through that process, and with more experience and just more tools in the toolbox, hopefully that will be an easier process for you.